This guy here is Les Boyd. He built a special hat so that birds could have sex with his head. You might be asking, who was Les Boyd and why did he build this copulation hat for thirsty birds? He wasn't just some kind of weirdo with a very strange fetish. He invented this sexy headgear for a reason. And we're going to find out what that was. Now to do that, we have to briefly travel back to the 1940s, when scientists began noticing the peregrine falcon was becoming alarmingly absent from the world. The number of peregrine falcons was so low, in fact, that it was functionally extinct in the eastern United States and western Europe. And in the 1970s, in the state of California, there were just 10 known peregrine nest sites. Obviously, a lot of people were very concerned about this. There was a massive push for environmental conservation in the 60s and the 70s, and at this point, a man named Joe Hickey entered the picture, and he started the ball rolling with the peregrine situation by organizing what was called the Madison Conference in 1965. He collected all the most prominent people together in falconry and the falcon conservation community, and they would all go on to combine forces and solve the problem of impending falcon extinction. And one of the people who attended this conference would actually go on to link the popular pesticide DDT to the peregrine's decline. He would take that evidence to William Ruckelshaus, who was the head of the EPA at the time. And then marine biologist Rachel Carson published her famous work Silent Spring in the years directly following the conference. And in 1972, Ruckelshaus banned the use of DDT. A lot of the people who assembled for the Madison Conference, or who were inspired by it, weren't professionals in ecology or conservation in any way, and they weren't researchers. They were just regular people. A lot of them had a personal link to the birds. Les Boyd, the guy who made the sexy time bird hat, was just a passionate falconer with a background in poultry science. Before he came along, researchers were having trouble breeding peregrines in captivity, and Les Boyd fixed this problem in a number of ways, with the most entertaining way being the Falcon Fornicator fedora. That doesn't actually work very well because it looks like more of a beanie, with the tassel being the falcon. Here's a video of a local ABC station report on how the device actually works from 2019. That is just amazing to watch. Listen, if you have kids around, just please shield their eyes. Don't put them to bed after having seen this.
Is it done?
So the hat collects male falcon sperm, and then the breeder uses the sperm to fertilize falcon eggs. And Les Boyd's invention was a major turn in the story of recovering the peregrine falcon population. But the hat was actually only one minor part of the process he created. One of the most important things that gets massively overlooked because of the boning hat is just so visible and it takes up all of the air in the story, well, this is the fact that he pioneered quite a lot of important techniques in falcon breeding. And one of them had to do with behavioral imprints. Because falcons imprint on humans in captivity when they're born, but they don't just do that magically or automatically, and Boyd figured out that process. He had to design a way to imprint males in order for them to want to bang his head, so that he could use them as sperm donors. And then he also had to figure out a way to have female falcons imprint so that he could get them to want to be inseminated and then carry the eggs to term. And researchers at the time were doing absolutely everything they could to optimize falcon propagation. So they were doing things like pioneering techniques for increasing egg yield. So they figured out how to take eggs as they were being laid, which made the female falcons actually lay more eggs, so they could get a dozen or so out of them at a time in order to increase their odds of successful hatching. And then they figured out how to track egg weight so that they could monitor any weight loss, which is a big risk factor for losing viable eggs. And one of the things that DDT would do is to thin down the egg walls, which would then make the hatchlings non-viable. And the researchers would make changes in order to help those eggs maintain their weight so that specific eggs that would normally not hatch in the wild could hatch in a captive environment. And Les Boyd's imprinting process was important here again because they would then take the eggs to an incubator in order to optimize the birth rates. And then after taking the eggs away, they'd have to be able to bring them back to the parents about a week or so after they hatched, or they'd give them to foster parents, and they'd need to have those falcons want to raise the young. One of the Madison Conference attendees was a man named Tom Cade, and he would leave the conference fired up enough to found an entire organization called the Peregrine Fund. And Les Boyd's story intersects with history because the Peregrine Fund had the resources and funding to implement his innovations at scale. With the help of the Peregrine Fund, the falcon population was poised to recover for the first time in many decades. Sex hats all around. There was a lot of skepticism surrounding the idea that recovering the falcon population in a captive environment would even work in the first place. And then after the goalposts were moved a bit by the skeptics, there was a lot of resistance to the idea that falcons who were raised in a captive setting would ever survive out in the wild. This is something that I remember hearing all about when I was growing up, because the conventional wisdom back then at the time was that you weren't even supposed to touch a wild bird or a wild animal, even if it was a baby and it was injured, because nursing it back to health meant that its parents and its community would surely abandon it, which is, not true. The idea from the Peregrine Fund was that a captive falcon, which is where the whole sport of falconry came from in the first place, by capturing and training wild falcons, the idea was that a wild falcon could be captured and trained for hunting in less than a month, and so they felt that this process could also be easily reversed. And then this would allow for captive falcons to be released into the wild, where they would thrive. Specifically, there's a process when training falcons called hacking, where the birds are given free rein and let loose to basically do as they please, but they're taken to a specific site, and they're made to be dependent on the human falconer for food. So this allows trainers to build up their talents, their skills, their confidence, and their independence, but they become tethered to their human hunting partner. Ultimately, what happens then in falconry is that the birds are recaptured and then fully captive going forward. And the thought was that tweaking this process just a bit could easily be made into a technique for fully releasing captive falcons who were bred in captivity. You just wouldn't recapture them, and slowly and steadily just allow the birds to be less dependent on you. The Peregrine Fund's Rocky Mountain program worked on natural cliffs, on waterfowl refuges, or big open country, anywhere where a lot of food resources existed. Peregrines prefer to nest on scenic, rocky outcroppings overlooking bodies of water. And so these are the kinds of places where breeders would set up their hack towers. They'd have to hike into these sites, sometimes many miles, because the locations were purposely very remote. When the falcons were fully mature and ready to go, they'd be released into the wild and then dispersed from the hack sites. Most of the people working on this weren't professionals, scientists, or researchers, but falconers and amateurs who were simply passionate about falcon recovery and conservation. They not only donated a great deal of their time and expertise and energy and efforts, but they even donated their birds in a lot of cases in order to ensure the success of the program. Falcon decline is just one of many stories from the DDT years, and in fact, those years continue today. DDT was an incredibly successful and very potent insecticide. It also caused irreparable harm to the environment and countless species living in it. Even now, and likely many, many decades from now, we feel that legacy still, and we'll feel it for many years. Even in the disposal efforts of DDT after the ban, shortcuts were taken by companies like the largest Los Angeles-based producer, which designed a plan that involved shipping barrels out into the deep ocean near Catalina, where the area of water would just be so massive that all the DDT could be diluted enough to avoid causing any future harm. And yet many of the ships just dumped the barrels close to the shore instead. And when barrels wouldn't sink, they'd puncture them so that they would, which would prematurely release all those toxic chemicals into the susceptible parts of the environment. And before the ban, the United States went through as much as 80 million pounds of DDT every single year. DDT kept the soldiers of World War II safe from malaria and typhus, and just one single topical application could last for months. Brigadier General James Simmons called DDT, quote, "the war's greatest contribution to the future health of the world." It would then go on to explode in popularity in farming, keeping the world's crops safe from all the pesky critters who would eat our food long before it had the chance to get to grocery store shelves. Sadly, many of those same critters would go on to face a struggle for survival. And DDT didn't just eliminate immediate threats to agriculture, it had lasting consequences from far-reaching and unintended consequences. Because DDT is very chemically stable, and it doesn't dissolve in water, and it does get stored in fats, and it bioaccumulates, or exists in increasing doses as it moves up the food chain. In the 1960s, scientists saw a huge decrease in populations of sea lions and pelicans, condors, and increased cancer rates in a lot of fish. The situation was very bad, specifically for predators like falcons, or anything that rests at the top of the food chain, like people, for example. There is a generations-long study involving 15,000 women and running from 1959 to 1965 that demonstrates an epigenetic connection to the harmful effects of DDT, as in changes to the gene expression that are inherited by children. This study and others are uncovering a troubling link that might mean that DDT is responsible for higher rates of certain cancers in people long after their mothers or grandmothers were exposed to DDT. Now, who's going to make a hat that we can have sex with. DDT took down a lot of animals and a lot of the environment, but peregrine falcons have always held a special place in the human heart. Falconry is an incredibly old activity. The earliest record of falconry comes from Mesopotamia in 2000 BCE. In 680 BCE, we find the first Chinese records of falconry. And then in the 4th century BCE, Aristotle told us that in Thrace, young boys who would go off to hunt small birds would bring hawks with them. He wrote that the boys would call the hawks by name, and they would swoop down on the birds. And then the hawks would either catch the birds, or they would force them into the bushes where the boys could get them. And when the hawks did catch them, they would drop them in front of the boys. And then the hawks would get a portion of whatever was caught when the hunt was over. So basically, he's describing modern falconry. Originally thought to be a practical hunting endeavor, falconry transitioned into a sport and a status symbol for nobility all over the world, from England to Japan. Though some nomadic societies like the Bedouins did continue to engage in falconry practically in order to supplement their limited food sources. Today, falcons are still used to control pest species. They're used in places like hotels and airports and other commercial buildings and landfills and even urban centers to control birds and other animals like squirrels and rabbits that would otherwise reproduce rapidly and overrun those locations. Falconry is a successful natural modern pesticide in the same way that bats are. And I talk a little bit about that in my video about the spookiest fact about bats that I did for Halloween last year. Except the main positive here is that falcons probably won't give you rabies. I think. So that's kind of nice. Peregrine falcons were removed from the U.S. endangered species list in August of 1999. It's now legal to capture wild falcons for falconry again in the United States and many other countries. Here in the US, there are permits and legal regulations to jump through, and only after you pass a 100-question exam and become eligible can you then get a license. And all of that comes after several years of training and extensive money and resources that you spend traveling and trapping your own falcon and feeding and training that falcon, feeding and training yourself, after finding a master falconer who actually wants to help you, and so on. If you're curious, you can find the specific regulations outlined below in 50 CFR of the US Code. I posted that down in the didgeridoo along with all the other sources for this video. Peregrine Fund went on to recover other birds in the US, and they used the same techniques to bring back from the brink several other bird populations like the California condor, the harpy eagle, the Mauritius kestrel, the orange-breasted falcons in Central America, the Ridgway's hawk, and the Puerto Rican sharp-skinned hawk. There is a bit of controversy that's worth mentioning over the falcon propagation that the Peregrine Fund brought about. Because of the limited peregrine population, the gene pool was very small, and the fund had to sometimes use falcon species that weren't peregrines in order to make sure that healthy offspring would come about. And there were also the donor falcons that were used, and I don't see a lot of records of provenance for any of those guys, some of whom, or many of whom, may have been captured from wild populations of all different types of falcons. There are lots of them. There's 19 recognized subspecies of falcons, and they exist on every continent except Antarctica. But in general, the successful propagation and repopulation of falcon species in America generally overlooks the fact that some of them may not have been purebred. If you want to do some f***ing good out there to help certain bird species and other animals recover from harmful environmental catastrophes like the loss of life and the loss of habitat due to DDT and other environmental disasters, I've included a bunch of links below in the didgeridoo to lists of conservation organizations, and you can simply donate money and throw them a couple of bucks, and that will generally go toward funding for key resources and equipment and programs. There's also several volunteer opportunities down there if you want to invest your time and energy in support of keeping the natural world safe from future harm and ongoing past harm. Groups like the World Wildlife Fund, the Nature Conservancy, the Trust for Public Land, and more animal-specific orgs like the National Audubon Society, Trout Unlimited, Ducks Unlimited, and many, many, many more. All of these places could use your help and your support, and so could the animals and environments that they keep safe. The one thing I'll briefly mention is something that I always bring up when talking about nonprofits, and a lot of people always have questions about how you evaluate an organization and how you figure out if they're really doing some good in the world or just pocketing your cash and pretending. And that's where resources like Charity Navigator come in. Charity Navigator is not a sponsor of this channel. I simply learned to use it back when I was working on campaigns for the ACLU and Planned Parenthood because I could guide people to the pages about those organizations, and that's where they could find their financials, and they could find reviews, and they could see where the money was actually going if they were on the fence about donating. So make sure to use it if you want want to look into how a certain nonprofit is doing that you aren't familiar with. Check out those resources, keep being the coolest version of yourself that you can be, and don't forget that even if you don't donate or volunteer for the environment or conservation, there are countless ways out there to do some good in your own little sphere of influence in the world. And I will see you next time when we talk about another one of those ways. Super fun trivia, but the word falcon was originally only designed to refer to female peregrines. Male peregrines are actually supposed to be called Tiercels, but everyone just started calling all female falcons by the name Falcon, and then all of the falcons were called Falcon, regardless of whether they were male or female, so that's what they're known as today. The more you know, the more things you can get to have sex with your head.